what the pro-Palestine camp doesn't do is clearly say out loud, what's the threat to Palestinian life? What is it that is harming them that makes you pro-Palestine? So you needing to say that you're pro-Palestine rests on an idea that something is against Palestine and Palestinians, that there's an antagonist in the story, but they don't mention that antagonist. And that's why I felt like it was really important for us to, really define ourselves as anti-Zionism.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Right of Resistance. I'm Kuros Charney. My guest today is Dr. Sabreena Ghaffar-Siddiqui. She is a distinguished public scholar and outspoken advocate for Palestinian liberation who last year was removed from her dual roles as senior DEI advisor and professor of sociology and criminology because of her Palestine advocacy. Nevertheless, she continues her work challenging systems of oppression as a prominent voice online. She engages in sharp debates on faith, politics, and decolonization. Her work bridges academia and activism using bold and incisive commentary to rally communities around the world to speak up for truth and justice. Dr. Sabreena Ghaffar-Siddiqui, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. So if you could just talk us through briefly your experience at Sheridan College, what happened, why you were removed, how that all played out.
Yeah, so assuming many of your viewers are not Canadians, so I'll just kind of give a little background as to what is Sheridan College. It's one of the most kind of like prominent colleges in Canada, I'd say, very well respected and long-standing. And I had been a professor at Sheridan College for 5 years, like ever since I got my PhD. I got hired as a professor, and I had been working in their like humanities and social sciences department, teaching sociology and criminology. I've also taught criminal psychology. Um, a few years ago, I got hired as a senior advisor, DEI knowledge mobilization and translation. And this was because of 10 years or so of my work in the DEI industry. I've been running my own consultancy practice as well. So I was brought in with great fanfare. They were so proud to have me come in and represent Sheridan College's DEI department and the work that they were doing nationally. I mean, we're talking about, a $2 million government grant that we were working with in order to, make higher education institutions and corporate nonprofit workplaces more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. And I was, a very key kind of member of our team in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
I literally had like articles written about me in the Sheridan College paper, in the magazine, and also I think it's important to note that my advocacy on Palestine and many other topics, anti-Black racism, Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ plus kind of issues and incidences that have arisen as well over the many years that I've been doing this work. I've been a prominent voice for many marginalized groups, communities, and talking about these topics. And they were very well aware of my Palestine advocacy. In fact, when I was brought in, I was kind of commended for it. But then October 7th happened, and I just continued doing what I've always done. I continued being a social justice advocate online. And, I was initially made to feel very safe because I worked in a team where it was made kind of clear to me that I was working with allies. So these are people who apparently went to the protests and, I mean, they're in the DEI world. So it just kind of, you'd imagine it comes naturally, to oppose systems of oppression and colonialism and settler colonialism and occupation. So initially it was very much like a supportive environment. And then I was leading a webinar online representing Sheridan College and this and the government of Canada, this project that we were in charge of. And I gave a land acknowledgement. And in the land acknowledgement, I acknowledged settler colonialism elsewhere and what was happening in Palestine. And I mentioned the unfortunate lives lost, Israeli lives lost, and Palestinians. And during the webinar, a ton of like there were these spam messages that were coming in from a Zionist attendant, and they had taken issue with the fact that so the webinar was about disability justice, and I was told that, oh, this has nothing to do with disability justice, which is ironic, considering we've got the largest number of amputees ever to have been recorded in Gaza, child amputees. But anyway, so I was told that this has nothing to do with disability. I came on here to learn about disability inclusion, and why did you mention Palestine before you mentioned Israel as a Jew, blah, 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 blah. And there were just spam messages coming in. And, we kind of like dealt with the situation, and I was told it was completely fine. I did nothing wrong. It was a land acknowledgement that I had approval on beforehand. But then over the next few days, what happened was there was an onslaught of emails and messages that were coming into, I mean, it had been happening for months anyway, because this webinar was, like a month or so after October 7th, or a couple of months after. So for a couple of months, there were complaints that had come in. But this time, this complaint landed in the president's office. And all of a sudden, I was told I'm in trouble. And an investigation was done. They found I had not done anything that was anti-Semitic. By reading a land acknowledgement, I wasn't being anti-Semitic. But I started to get bullied. I started to face these internal toxic workplace dynamics where the same allies who supposedly cared about what was happening to Palestinians all of a sudden told me that I was told that if I was to stay in this role, that I wasn't allowed to have my own land acknowledgement. I was not allowed to speak about politics. I was told that I can't speak about Palestine. So, all these, and then there was all this bullying and aggression that I was feeling. And I was essentially ousted. Like I was forced to resign because, as someone in this field doing this work, whose work aligns so deeply with systems of oppression and anti-racism and, anti-colonialism and all of that, it was just, what I was being told that I can and cannot say didn't align with my worldview and my work. So I resigned from that role, and I already have had quite a large social media following. So in order to like dampen the blow that Sheridan was going to get, they offered me a role in the professor role that I was in previously, just to kind of like keep me quiet. And but then I was in that role for 2 terms, and the third term they didn't renew my contract. So they placed me in a vicarious, like very kind of like like fragile, vulnerable role, and then they didn't renew my contract. So yeah, I was ousted, and then I lost my job, and it was all because of the onslaught of Zionist complaints that had come in, all because I mentioned Palestine.
And these complaints, I mean, they were largely anonymous, or they were, I mean,
No, I mean,
there
the
were people,
person the person
Sure.
who had made the complaint to the president's office was, in this webinar as
Right.
themselves, and
Okay.
they were a leader in the DEI industry.
Right.
So, It wasn't anonymous.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, all right. Well, and so since then, I mean, you've of course maintained your advocacy, and here we are 2 years later, and there is some kind of ceasefire slash peace plan, it seems, in Gaza, which much of what we're still trying to, I guess, make sense of. I mean, you have some thoughts on that, right? What should we make of it? Obviously, it hasn't addressed the larger issue of apartheid and occupation of Palestinian lands. But what are your thoughts in terms of where Palestine advocacy goes from here, given the current situation?
I mean, when it comes to this ceasefire that you talk about,
Yeah.
it's really not a matter of opinion or thoughts. It's about facts. And
Right.
fact remains that I think yesterday 100 Palestinians had been killed.
Hmm.
I was just a few days ago, the ceasefire had been violated over
Hmm.
80 times. You know, the fact of the matter is that fire has not ceased,
Yeah.
right? Like there has been no ceasing of the horrors.
Hmm.
And more news is coming out of the level of carnage that had taken place in the last 2 years. I mean, we've got bodies of Palestinian prisoners and hostages coming back who cannot even be identified because of the level of um, deterioration
Yeah.
and harm that was done to the body. So, I mean, there is this talk of ceasefire and a lot of like self-gloating and self-aggrandizing from Trump, calling himself, the peace president. But the fact of the matter is this is more of the same. It's, and I call this I've said that, what we saw before October 7th was a slow drip genocide.
Hmm.
And after October 7th, it was full flow. And what we've gone back to again now is that genocide a slower drip, right? So the genocide hasn't stopped. The killing of children and people has not stopped. And that's why we can't actually, you know, we can't say that this is a ceasefire, isn't a
Hmm.
ceasefire. And the other thing is that, you can't ceasefire a genocide, right?
Yeah.
Like like if it's a war, which we don't believe it is, then sure, you can ceasefire a war, but you can't ceasefire a genocide.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, maybe the better question is sort of how to combat the current narrative. Because obviously, I mean, to your point, what Trump is saying, what Netanyahu is saying, is that, okay, well, here, you have your ceasefire, you have your, so, stop talking, stop complaining,
Yeah.
whatever. It's sort of, it seems in a way designed to distract from or suppress any kind of, uh, speech about actual Palestinian liberation, and so I guess, yeah. I mean, how does one combat that narrative? Do you think?
Because I think, what has happened is for like decades now, we've been sold this lie, this false notion of a two-state solution,
Hmm.
right? Like that there's some like phantom two-state solution where, Palestinians and Israelis will hold hands and sing kumbaya after this level of carnage. And that was never a reality. It was not something that could have ever happened. And that's also the reason why, this idea of recognizing the state of Palestine, all whilst still supplying weapons for the genocide, by these countries like Canada and Australia and the UK, um, it's absurd. It's a bit ridiculous, right? That you're going to recognize the state of Palestine, but then at the same time, you're going to strip that state. You're going to strip the people of any agency whatsoever. Hamas is an elected government, right,
Right.
by the people, and for the statehood to be dependent on disarming the government or disarming the power, the people who are in power in that area is like uh basically a death sentence for everybody that's there. and it's obviously steeped in this Orientalist narrative that, or this Orientalist trope that, Arabs and Muslims and, these people in the Middle East, they can't govern themselves. They're not mature enough. They're inherently barbaric, inherently violent, that they only have arms because they want to harm other people. But the language of defense and security is reserved for the Europeans on the other side, Israelis, essentially, Europeans who are there. And, that language of defense and the ability to be able to defend yourself. And, there's a fear of this inherently barbaric group on the other side. And you're allowed to have arms, but then Palestinians are not allowed to have arms. When we have seen for 2 years the level of barbarity from the Israeli offensive forces. So there's this like it's contradiction, obviously, but the thing is that people fell for it before, and I don't think people are falling for it now. And what the general climate, I spend a lot of time online and on social media on X, and what my analysis has been that the general climate has completely flipped. And I think that Netanyahu, other people in power, the US, I mean, Trump just today said that there was a time when you would be canceled for saying something about Israel, but today you will be canceled if you defend Israel. Now, I know he was trying to make a
Right.
case
It's
for
complaining. Yeah.
oh my God, these poor
Yeah.
Israelis and anti-Semitism hysteria. But it was actually quite telling and interesting what he
Mhm.
said, because it did point to the change of tone. And that's the
Right.
thing. Every now and then, Trump just slips out the truth, and people think he's, stupid, but he's just being honest. And the truth is that, yes, now the people who make up, the public in these Western countries, they don't buy into it anymore. They don't buy into this idea
Mhm.
of Israel must defend itself and has a right to defend itself. So, ceasefire, no ceasefire, they've lost the narrative war.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And so that, I mean, I think touches upon something that you've been talking about as well. This idea of mental colonization. How we're mentally colonized, right? And I thought that was particularly resonant. Today, as more and more people in the West are shedding their illusions. About not only the U.S. Israel relationship, but sort of Western liberalism, functioning as a kind of veil for imperial violence, in cases like this. Um, so, is this? I mean, are we in the process of decolonizing our minds, or how do we go about that? What in what ways do you think we're still mentally colonized, and how do we break free from that?
So I think that, October 7th, I think, will historically be remembered for most people who've been paying attention to what's happened in the last 2 years, as a shift in, you know, the level of colonization of people's minds, right? Like I often say that October 7th was what galvanized people into kind of questioning their position, especially racialized people, racialized people, Black, Indigenous, racialized, from marginalized groups. We have so many people from the LGBTQ plus communities who have stood side by side and have been very loud and, calling for ceasefire, free Palestine, all of that. And even those communities have seen the limits of their freedom, right? Like, how free are we really? Right? Like, how much are we allowed to say, if Palestine is that limit, and it became that litmus test where it's the Palestine exception, where you're progressive except for Palestine, or you believe in democracy except for Palestine, you believe in freedom of speech except for Palestine. And of course, it's always positioned as this, you know, antagonist to Jewish identity and Jewish safety, which is not the case. But that's how it's positioned to suppress people's speech. But I do think that that was the catalyst, like, you know, the way that our governments responded to Israel's, you know, kind of onslaught, and like the bombing, and the bombing of hospitals and schools, and like the mass killing and the flattening of Gaza, and the kind of commentary we were seeing from leaders and people in positions of power. It just opened people's eyes, and they were like, what the hell? Like, you know, these are the same people who claim to be liberals and claim to be progressive. And so that illusion, you know, really, I think, was shaken. Hence why, you know, Biden, you know, lost, you know,
Yeah.
Kamala Harris lost, and, you know, the Biden administration was so hated, and Trump came into power. A lot of that had to do with that illusion of, you know, liberalism and democracy and free speech and all of that kind of like fading. So I think that it started after then. And we saw a lot of people break free, like they broke free from those shackles of colonization, I always say, you know, those mental shackles where, you know, we were told that we couldn't say the word genocide. Remember when we couldn't even use the word genocide? And now
Hmm.
it's, you know, like obviously uh, exactly what it is. But there was a time where if you used the word genocide, you would lose your job,
Yeah.
like, you know, just months after October 7th. So people were realizing early on that, you know, if I am going to lose my job for something like this, for speaking up, but then I didn't lose my job when I said something about Ukraine and something against Russia, you know, like people started to make these comparisons, and they were like, why is it that this is okay, but this isn't okay? And it started the process of mental decolonization. But of course, we needed academics and intellectuals who have been doing this work for so long, you know, decolonization work, anti-colonization work, um, to come out and explain and kind of make people understand the very insidious ways in which we are colonized. You know, like uh, something like the fact that Zoran Mamdani eating with his hands
Hmm.
has become an issue of contention, not just for the right, but also for the left. The
Hmm.
fact that people from racialized communities have commented on that picture and said, ew, that's gross.
Hmm.
The level of internalized colonialism that you view ancestral ways of eating, you know, as disgusting. And then it unearthed, you know, and it revealed the inconsistencies in people's logic when it comes to it, right? So you can eat, you know, fried chicken with your fingers, but you can't, and you can eat a burger with your fingers, but the moment that you pick up a piece of naan and dip it in, you know, like
Right.
korma, that's disgusting. Like, you know, so people, so this kind of like revealed the insidious ways in which we are internally colonized, where we view ourselves lesser than. And those are the things that I've been kind of pointing out to. And like, you know, that feminism, how feminism is weaponized for imperialist goals. You know, like there was this picture that went viral of some Zionist who was in Israel, and she's wearing like a yoga outfit. You probably saw it, and she was like, "This
Hmm.
is the only country in the Middle East that
Yeah.
I wouldn't get, like, you know, arrested for wearing this." And you know, it just revealed, and one of the things I said, what I responded to was, you know, appealing to Western imperialist feminism is so 2001, right? We're
Yeah.
so over that because people don't buy into it anymore.
Yeah. Well, it's often, I mean, yeah, that argument is so relentless in that. I mean, it's so beside the point in terms of like, you know, w- um, you know, culture, whatever cultural practices exist in a particular country does not justify genocide or, occupation or oppression, of those people, right? And whether you can, wear yoga pants in one place or another is really beside the point. But yeah, it's certainly internalizing, these Western ideals. Uh, yeah. So I mean, if we go back for a moment to your work, both in DEI and as a professor of sociology and criminology, and just sort of like generally as a scholar of social justice issues, looking back, pre October 7th, do you feel that, either pre or post, I mean, do you feel that essentially there was always an expectation that you play a certain type of role, as a however you want to describe yourself, as a racialized descendant of immigrants, or like that, um this idea of like not really, that institutions not recognizing that social justice is essentially about resistance, and about resistance to power, and resistance to, power kind of oppressing marginalized communities. Do you feel like there was, I don't know if my question is making so much sense. Like, there's an expectation that there's a role to play, as opposed to like being, honest about, your expertise, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think, and that's, actually a really good question,
Hmm.
because this is something that I have thought about, written about. I will talk a little later about, my upcoming book, which is,
Hmm. Please.
I've co-authored with a colleague. It's called DEI Undone, and it should be coming out in a couple of months. And it kind of goes in depth into these topics and this question that you raise. I think the reason why it was hard for me to like initially even land a role like this in like a leadership position, even though I had done a lot of consultancy work in DEI, PhD in sociology. I think it's because the industry, the DEI industry, has become so performative, and it values tokenism over authenticity. And although I'm a racialized Muslim woman, I don't tick boxes in many
Hmm.
ways, right? And in our book, we call this checkwity, where you check the boxes that, someone, and, funnily enough, this was a joke that was made in my department, where we would invite people to speak and somebody would be like, oh, wow, this person is Black, disabled and queer, they check so many of the DEI boxes, right? And it was disgusting, right? Like when I
Yeah.
first heard that joke, I was like, this is horrible. But it revealed the ugliness of the DEI industry. It's an industry at the end of the day. It still serves uh, corporate structures and capitalism. We're inviting people to come and speak on topics and paying them like $10,000 for uh, to come and like just speak about something in a webinar with no actual real change happening on the ground. But yeah, like, so going back, my role, I think I have always been a threatening character, because I defied a lot of the stereotypes about Muslim women. I've always defied stereotypes, very ridiculous stereotypes, where Muslim women are oppressed and Muslim women are forced into this and Muslim women don't have a voice and Muslim women all have Arab accents, or like, South Asian women look like this, sound like this. And, you know, I never, because I have always had such a decolonized mind, I've always come forward with my full identity. I've never shied away from talking about the fact that I have a South Asian background from Afghanistan and Pakistan. I speak 7 languages. I'm Muslim. So I've always spoken about these things, but I never fit the mold, And so initially it was like a lot of these DEI roles for Muslim women were given to women who wear hijab because that would be chequity, right? And a Muslim woman who doesn't wear a hijab doesn't fit the kind of token identity that they wanted. They wanted a token person. They also wanted someone who wasn't very loud and wasn't very, speaking truth to power type, which I always have been. So when I landed this role, I was quite pleased that the people who brought me in were, um, happy about my advocacy and saw that as a value add for the team. But of course, that the limit for that was Palestine, right? Like and this is where I always come back to this, and I always say Palestine is the litmus test. Like my husband actually makes fun of me because I will like literally like people or not like people based on their stance on Palestine. Like I would be friends with them or not friends with them, or a celebrity I will like or not like. Like I'll quickly search up to see what their stances are. Are they a Zionist? Are they not a Zionist? And I always say to him that because it is literally a litmus test, not just for, justice, but also for like courage and character and integrity. And for me, those are human values and characteristics that I kind of center in my friendships and relationships. So like, I would get turned off from someone who doesn't have the courage to speak up and just overlooks a terrible thing happening. And so, yeah, Palestine was that litmus test, and my institution failed it. And I was just a bit too loud and a bit too It was like they were talking about decolonization. Like we need to decolonize the college. We need to decolonize this. We need to decolonize that. But then someone came along who was actually decolonized, and they're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Now this is going a little bit too far, like we need you to kneel to power. We need you to be grateful. And this, this word grateful is really, really important. And I know you mentioned this whole like descendant of immigrants and my racial identity, Muslim identity. This word gratitude, it's very like important for me because it's something that's always been expected of my immigrant parents, of me, of so many racialized immigrants I see around me, where the, defiance in terms of your ingratitude, it's seen as defiance. And it's rooted in this idea that you must be grateful for the crumbs we've given you. You must be grateful for what we've done for you. And it's this white saviorism and, the benevolence of the colonizer. I'm sure you've been following the case of Dr. Rahma in the UK, the doctor who could be losing her license. She already, was went through an investigation and went through a tribunal and won her case. And she's being tried again. And the main reason that I gather that she is being retried is that the evidence that they've given forward is on this notion of she didn't show gratitude because she went back to her social media posts, which wasn't anywhere in the outcome, or like it wasn't stipulated. It wasn't said that you can no longer make social media posts, but they were so offended by the fact that she didn't show gratitude that she was allowed to practice, that they're retrying the case like that, and that's why this word gratitude, when it comes to like immigrant communities, like for me, it's such an important term and word and idea and concept that we need to talk about, that a lot of the backlash that we have gotten, academics, people who have titles and who, one could say that we had proximity to power. We had proximity to the colonizer. We had proximity to the master's house. And the reason why they're upset with us is that we didn't show gratitude for the fact that we had all that proximity and we decided to speak up.
Yeah, no, those are great points. And it's, I mean, that framing I think is so important too. It's like if gratitude is expressed through being silent about genocide, about the destruction of a people, what does that say about gratitude? But what is that? Yeah, it does give the whole game away, I think. Uh, so on the yeah, I mean, back to the subject specifically of Palestine. So yes, you recently gained a bit of attention on social media for saying that you no longer identify as pro-Palestine, but instead identify as anti-Israel and as anti-Zionist. I think I know what you mean. However, it sounds like some people didn't. And of course, anti-Israel is something that's also used by right-wing media to smear Palestine advocacy, right? To sort of cast it as this irrational hatred of Israel as opposed to opposition to, apartheid, occupation, and genocide. So, would you mind talking a little bit about why you feel that distinction is important?
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, I can really compare it to this notion of, those who were wearing a ceasefire pin,
Mhm.
right? Like in the beginning, or the ones who were saying ceasefire now and not free Palestine, right? So there's the free Palestine crowd, and then there's the ceasefire now crowd. And the problem with the ceasefire now crowd is that they're looking at the entire situation from this post October 7th lens as though history began on October 7th. So we, need to cease fire so that lives can be saved, which, yes, of course, they will be saved, but you're completely disregarding and ignorant to the fact that lives were being taken prior to October 7th. Literally the day before October 7th, I believe October 6th, an article came out that it was the deadliest day or for people in Gaza, in the last 2 decades or a decade or something like that, right?
Mhm.
So the day before October 7th was terrible for Palestinians, and the day before, and the day before. So ceasefire now only looks at the situation from this narrow lens, whereas Free Palestine looks at it through the liberatory lens of, we want a free Palestine so that people can be free and not be stuck in this concentration camp that's been created, and where they are dealing with apartheid and oppression and occupation. So when it comes to this whole like pro-Palestine and anti-Zionism, anti-Israel point that I made is that, what happened as time went on, a lot of people, a lot of the ceasefire now people kind of, caught on to this whole like pro-Palestine, Palestinian identity. Keffiyehs, oh my God, I'm going to wear a keffiyeh because it's so woke and everybody's wearing it. Like, I believe Justin Bieber even wore one without saying anything, right? So you've got like celebrities who would just put it on but not give any kind of explanation or talk about it. Like, you've got the Coldplay types, right? Who
Mhm.
will both sides the genocide, where
Mhm.
we should be grateful, again, gratitude, that they're even mentioning Palestine, right? We need to be grateful that they acknowledge the existence of a people and the existence of something terrible happening to them. But, so you had all these people who were pro Palestine in the sense that they were pro Palestinians. They were pro the existence of Palestinians, you know, the right of life for Palestinians. But what the pro Palestine camp doesn't do is clearly say out loud what's the threat to Palestinian life? What what is it that
Right.
is harming them that makes you pro-Palestine? So you needing to say that you're pro-Palestine rests on an idea that something is against Palestine and Palestinians, that there's an antagonist in the story, but they don't mention that antagonist. And that's why I felt like it was really important for us to, really define ourselves as anti-Zionism. Just like when you say, I am anti-oppression, you could be pro-peace, you could be pro-kumbaya, let's hold hands and all be happy. But to be anti-oppression is to acknowledge that there is an oppressive force, that there is oppression somewhere, and you are against that oppression. Just like you could be not racist, but not an anti-racist, which is a bad thing. You should be an anti-racist. As well as not racist, you should also be an anti-racist. And, in the DEI world, we've been talking about this a lot, like what's the difference between not being racist and anti-racist? Anti-racist to really stand up to that system of racism and power and white supremacy. So by not defining yourself as anti-Zionist or anti-Israel, you're ignoring the antagonist, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're ignoring what the actual threat is to Palestinian life and safety. And I think that this movement actually has gained a lot of traction, the anti-Zionist movement. Again, like from my experience on social media, I think that I remember being like one of like a few people at the time who were proudly calling themselves anti-Zionist. And I've been doing it for a long time, but that post was made much later. But the number of people who will now say, I am anti-Zionist, it's not enough to be pro-Palestine. You have to be anti-Zionist. You have to be against the oppressive force, because the only way that peace can be achieved is if the oppression is taken away. The oppressor is combated, right? Like we must face the oppressor. And of course, the usual suspects will come out and say that to be anti-Zionist is to be anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic and this and that. But that's not what it is. Zionism is a political ideology. And the fact that there are more Christian Zionists in America than there are Jewish Zionists is saying something. So to be anti-Zionist is like saying I'm anti the Conservative Party, or I'm anti. It's being anti an ideology, right? Like you are against that ideology. Um, you're not against a people, a religious group. You are simply against the politicization. And there's no, denying the fact that Zionism loves to conflate Judaism with Zionism and anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, because it needs that. It needs anti-Semitism. It needs this hysteria of anti-Semitism to exist and the threat of Muslim terror to exist in order for it to justify its genocide. Not that genocide could ever be justified, but to justify its war, which we know is a genocide. And this kind of actually takes me to another point that I wanted to make. A lot of people are commenting on the fact that we've gone from seeing videos and images of, destruction and horror coming out of Gaza with a strange uptick in anti-Muslim and Islamophobic content online. Like it's just everywhere. You've got all these people who are, including that one post that I was mentioning where, the influencers like, oh, this is the only country in the world in the Middle East where I wouldn't be arrested for wearing this outfit. That is all to promote anti-Muslim sentiment, Islamophobia, because as many have commented and pointed out, they've realized that they can't get people to like Israel.
Mm-hmm.
It's not happening. People are not liking Israel. People are not believing in their right to self-defense. So the strategy shift is to make people hate Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can make people hate Muslims, then, the enemy of my enemy is my friend type of thing, right? So this is how they're trying to get so many people who are, who have subconscious biases and they've been all fed that same post 9/11 propaganda narrative, war on terror, the movies, the, you know, Homeland TV series, and like, all these, like literally for 25 years, we've been watching all this uh, kind of like anti-Muslim hysteria, Islamophobic hysteria, not just in America and the UK, but also in India, which happens to be the one of the largest um, kind of where the largest number of Islamophobic and anti-Muslim hate posts and ideas come from is actually India. So
Mhm.
Israel and India, those are the two, and which explains their alliance and their love for each other too, because both countries need the war on terror and this fear of Muslims in order for them to perpetuate their land theft and their colonization, which in India, is Kashmir. And in Palestine, you see the settler colonialism there. So, we're dealing with settler colonialism and anti-Muslim sentiment in both countries. So they need the world to hate Muslims and fear Muslims. And we've seen the shift happen. There's like a shift in strategy to get people worried about Muslims again.
Mhm. Yeah, and I mean, just even sort of the casualness with which it's been done in the New York City mayoral race, to the point where, Mamdani finally put out about a 7-minute video really talking about, um, even sort of acknowledging for himself that he had not really been, I guess, fully open about his, connection to Islam as a way of sort of, I guess just, trying to make it not conspicuous, right? Because of that, push to sort of, um, you know, use Islamophobia to, denigrate him um, but yeah, I mean, absolutely. I completely agree. So, well, I guess, one question I would have, or maybe, you sort of answered, it's like, to what extent should we even entertain, or respond to the attempts at this point to conflate, anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism? Because it's sort of like this thing. It's like you always have to footnote, your statements, your critiques of Zionism and Israel with, Zionism is not Judaism. I mean, are we at a point where we can sort of just not even get into that and just really focus on the issue at hand, or is it something that you think?
Unfortunately, I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah.
Um, Hence the constant needing to police our own language,
Mhm.
right? There's so much self censorship and suppression that happens because we're so afraid of any language that might be misconstrued or misunderstood or weaponized against us. And Muhammad al-Kurd talks about this as in his book, The
Mm, perfect.
Perfect Victim. Um, and I think, Muslims, especially in this post 9/11 climate, we have had to be perfect in our tone and our language and how we speak about issues. And, I can tell you, like, just as a personal story, even about myself, like I grew up in a household where, my parents were immigrants from Pakistan. Ancestrally, we're from Afghanistan. We speak Pashto and Urdu and a bunch of other languages. But my dad was very, very keen on me speaking English very well. He coming from a country that was reeling from colonialism. He was born right as Pakistan was created, like before Pakistan was created. And, it was, the effects of colonialism in Pakistan and the poverty and the infrastructure being so um, debilitated, it led him to England to be an immigrant. He had very high hopes for himself to be an engineer, but he chose to come to England to give his children a better opportunities. And I remember, my dad would always kind of feel very proud when I would speak, because I was always like a little bit mouthy, and I would talk back and have bold ideas. And I was always kind of like this, but in child form. And, every time I spoke English, he would be like, oh, look how great her English is. And it kind of instilled in my mind this idea that English is important, speaking English is important, and speaking it properly and really well is important. And, I gave one of my first news interviews, I think it was like 10 years or so ago, on one of the news channels. And it was funny because the most common word that people had used commenting under that video on my social media was, wow, you're so eloquent. You're so eloquent. You're so eloquent. And eloquent was the word that people just kept using. And it made me really think of this burden of eloquence that I've carried my whole life, where I have had to be so perfect in the way I speak, to the point that now, yes, people will say, wow, you speak so well, you're so eloquent. But it comes with, at the price of me being able to be eloquent in my mother tongue. I didn't speak, I can't speak Urdu or Pashto the way that I speak English. The way I intellectualize in English, I cannot do that in those languages. It's very conversational, emotional, conversational, but not intellectual, the way I speak in those languages. And I always say that, English, the English language, dances on the graves of my ancestral languages. It's come at a cost. And taking that further, this perfection that, the colonized subject and being internally colonized, right? We become so internally colonized that we value English and eloquence in English and speaking it very well, because we know that that's how you can have proximity to power and wealth and capital and opportunity and all of that. To further that, in this climate, in this kind of post-October 7th world, we also have to be perfect in our emotions and in our eloquence when it comes to responding to horrors. And I wrote a poem about this that has been featured in a book that is releasing next week. But the idea that as much as I want to scream, I cannot rage, like rage is not allowed for the racialized Muslim academic intellectual. Like, we're not allowed to be angry. We're not allowed to be mad. We have to always be intellectual. We have to always be proper. Even when we're talking about a child whose head has been blown open, we have to be very proper in the way we speak. And we must always center Jewish feelings, right? And this is where that Jewish supremacy comes in, and white supremacy, where we, have to play that same game. And it hurts me that I have to be this way. I mean, if I was honest, I would be raging on X every day. I would be mad. I would be, every single time I saw, the body of a child or a person just blown open, limbless, bloodied, I would be raging. But that's not allowed, right? We have to be perfect victims. We have to be proper. And the centering of Jewish safety, Jewish feelings, where the threat of a phantom genocide against Jews is more important than an actual genocide against Palestinians. And the only reason why is because Jewish people in Israel are white, predominantly white. And in America, there's a book called How Jews Became White in America. And it's really important because it talks about how Jews self-identify as white and they became white. Yes, it was a racial category at some point, but they became white. They enjoy the privileges of whiteness. And that's the most important thing to take from this, that if you're enjoying the privileges of whiteness, you cannot go back and say, well, I'm a Jew, but you've been enjoying the privileges of whiteness. You can't then say I'm not white when you want to just use the Jewish identity to self-victimize, right? So the only reason why Palestinian death and suffering and horror is accepted and acceptable is because they are black and brown and they're not white. They are racialized.
Mhm.
They're Arabs. It's an Orientalist um, gaze that looks to that part of the world. And, Israel is the Western outpost in the Middle East. It's a European Western country. And what's interesting is that they keep flip-flopping, it's like we're indigenous to the Middle East, but then they'll post pictures like the one that girl posted of her
Mhm.
in Western clothes and, you know, speaking and appealing to Western feminism, but claiming to be indigenous to the Middle East.
Yeah.
So there's this constant, like dichotomy there.
Yeah, I often hear that justification of, Israel, it's fighting to preserve Western values. And I'm like, well, why are you fighting to preserve Western values in the Middle East? Like, I mean, what? But, going back to the perfect victim narrative, and yeah, it's, you know, Muhammad El-Kurd's book, I feel like as I was reading that, I was, I had to annotate every page because every page there was something I thought was so, profound and quotable. Um, and it very much seems that, yes, the message is, to Palestinians, will end the occupation once you stop resisting occupation. And so I guess, I mean, how do we frame Palestinian resistance today? Because there's so much emphasis in it. It's like the oppressor always telling the oppressed how they should resist their oppression, right? No, you have to do it non-violently. You have to do it this way. And of course, I mean, however they do it, they get the same results. But I mean, I guess, I mean, how do we frame it moving forward? I mean, there has been, I think, some attempt. I mean, even just saying, Hamas is the government of Gaza. Hamas is a, resistance movement versus just Hamas is a terrorist group, right? That's an attempt to shift the Overton window. I mean, yeah, I guess just what are your general thoughts on, how do we frame Palestinian resistance
So,
as an
this whole conversation around like resistance and Hamas, and it really is rooted in white supremacy and Orientalism, because I'm sure you remember that when the war first broke out, in Ukraine, there were these um, news reports coming out. Do you remember the whole Molotov cocktails
Mhm. Mhm.
news report where, they literally had images of young girls and people making Molotov cocktails to resist and defend themselves. And it was being celebrated and it was made into this heroic thing. Like I remember the news articles coming out and, you know, we were we were like celebrating the will and the courage of Ukrainians who were making homemade bombs, right, to resist the oppressor. Why is it that that was seen as heroic, but then when you have Palestinians throwing rocks at tanks, it's seen as criminal,
Yeah,
to the
barbaric.
point where children are being arrested for that? There are children who've literally grown up in Israeli prisons, right? I think the longest standing prisoner who had come out was 40 years, maybe. I think it was 40 years or 20 years. Sorry, I don't quote me on that. But I mean, the same people who were telling us this started on October 7th are releasing Palestinian prisoners who had been in prison. So these people essentially grew up in prison and it was for resisting, right? So I had spoken about this at the time on the news when when the Ukraine war broke out, and we saw news reports of people talking about refugees and people wanting to flee Ukraine, and the slip of the tongue, the Freudian slip, where, these journalists were saying things like, I mean, this is different. These people have blonde hair and blue eyes. They look like us. So we should have more empathy. So we should be more concerned because they're white, because they look like Europeans, Westerners. So all of a sudden, the Syrian refugees and, the Sudanese refugees, the Somali refugees, like none of those matter. But the Ukrainian refugees do matter because they look like us. And then the narrative around the Molotov cocktails being made, basically essential, DIY bombs were being made by Ukrainians, and they were being, you know, like presented as heroes. So this difference in the way resistance is presented and celebrated when it comes to whiteness and Western looking people versus Middle Easterners, brown people. This is rooted in white supremacy and Orientalism, and, Orientalism being the notion that Arabs and people from the Middle East and Muslims are just inherently barbaric. They're not civilized. It's the Occident versus the
Right.
Orient. And, with the Occident always being the civilized group. And in this whole, what you said earlier about Israel wanting Palestinians to stop resisting, right? It's, I wrote a post about this not long ago about this idea that the colonizer, in their benevolence, offers the colonized the ability to peacefully protest and
Mm-hmm.
exercise their right to peaceful protest. And this is in their benevolence, right? And the reason why is because the colonizer sees the colonized as inherently barbaric. And the only way that you can prove that you are not barbaric is to peacefully protest. But what happens when people peacefully protest? Nothing. We have seen nothing has happened. Peaceful protest has done nothing for Palestinians. It also hasn't done anything in the West when it comes to 2 years of peaceful protest where people are protesting the genocide.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's all rooted in this like colonial ideology, colonial logic of the inherently barbaric person, marginalized person having to prove that they are not something that the colonizer has defined them as. And that's the same reason why we have to speak with such eloquence, because inherently my people aren't eloquent, apparently, right?
Hmm.
So I have to prove how civilized I am by not showing rage, by not showing emotion, by speaking very eloquently, by being very proper, by my words not in any way, shape, or form, being mean to Jewish people. So
Right.
that's what's expected, right?
Right. As in terms of, protests to nonviolent versus violent, I mean, is there something between nonviolent protest and armed resistance? I mean, in the West, in terms of being more disruptive, I mean, there are, I suppose, but, what are your thoughts on that about, how people might resist both, oppression here at home and what our government is doing abroad, in a more disruptive way?
So, I mean, resistance to oppression, I think this whole like violent, nonviolent in itself, this whole language around violent and nonviolent protest or resistance is very
Mm.
much rooted in colonial logic, right?
Sure.
Is um, if somebody was breaking into your home, is there a peaceful way
No.
to protest?
No. No, I mean you're right. So yeah, let me I guess you're right. I'm speaking the language of the colonizer because I assume that I'm still, I'm broadcasting from the belly of the beast here, so I'm trying to
Wasn't a criticism of
yes,
you
yes, no. But I
at
mean
all. Yeah.
to your point, yeah, I'm wondering if there's a way we can kind of uh, have this conversation in a more instructive way. I mean, just well, I guess my point is that you, I think most people here don't want to, take up arms to, address whatever grievances they have. But I'm wondering if there are more things that people can and need to be willing to do. I mean, just because, you look at the civil rights movement, right? And obviously, sort of textbooks examples of boycotts, things that were actually economically disruptive to, you know, m- elicit change versus just holding signs and, marching and saying,
I
what we
think that
feel.
the thing with the civil rights movement too, that people forget is that, it was a culmination of
Hmm.
of, I hate to use the word violent resistance, but like I think more like physical praxis or like the action, like, a material resistance as opposed to theoretical or like, what I'm trying to say is that the civil rights movement or the success of it, I almost feel like it gets um it's propagandized, just like they love Martin Luther King and they
Hmm.
love to talk about him as um as this kind of like peaceful, diplomatic, kind of like very calm resistor, more in theory than in practice. But the truth is that Martin Luther King did have things that he said, like his letter from the Birmingham jail,
Hmm.
that people don't usually talk about, which was more like, aggression. It was more aggressive in tone. Um, but the point I'm trying to make here is that most of these movements, right, like they are a culmination and a combination of lots of different actions taking place. But the one that gets all the attention is the one that the colonizer is pleased with. So, Gandhi is very much glorified
Hmm.
as the person, who represents the freedom of Indians from British colonialism and how he did it in a peaceful way. But people often forget characters like Bhagat Singh, who was a revolutionary and who did use violent means, right? And all of these things were happening at the same time. There were lots of different groups resisting in different ways, but the group and the people and the movement within the movement that gets the attention in terms of like history is written by the winners, right? Or the people who,
Yeah.
like, if you read the history of India from a British perspective, of course they're gonna celebrate Gandhi and not Bhagat Singh, right? And it's the same thing with like the civil rights movement. That's the point that I was trying to make with that. But the point here is that you cannot fight an entire oppressive system that oppresses you theoretically and physically, right? Because I think people often forget that the colonial systems of oppression that we live under, like in Canada, we have a colonial system of oppression. This is a settler colony, right? And the only thing that's changed is that we've gone from the residential school system where children were taken from their homes and put in these residential schools to now having a foster care system that is, like unbelievably heavy in terms of how many Indigenous children are in the foster care system who are taken from their families and put in the foster care system. So these, like the tools change, the buildings change, the names of the policies change, but it's the same thing repeating itself. It's the same kind of oppression. Um, Same thing with with America, and how we can say that slavery has just been transformed into the prison industrial complex. So, Black and racialized people are imprisoned, and it's a form of enslavement, right? Still that same exertion of power. And the point that I was trying to make with all of this, the question was like, the question was about resistance, right? Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
So
what is?
you, you have to have, practical ways as well as theoretic. Like, we can't,
Mhm.
if the system is oppressing you in thought and in practice and physically by chaining you, putting you behind bars, taking you from your family and putting you in a foster care system where you will be exposed to you're more likely to experience sexual violence and physical violence. Like if you were being physically harmed and mentally harmed, and your career and your prospects and your ability to have life chances, what we call in sociology, is going to be your life chances are going to be limited, then the reaction to that also has to be multi-pronged, right? Like it can't just be that we are resisting these systems by simply boycotting or protesting on the streets. There has to be like physical resistance, like what so many, like, you could talk about the Freedom Flotilla, the Sumud
Mhm.
Flotilla trying to physically break the siege. It was one form of physical resistance. And if nothing else, it pushed the bar a little bit. It got people thinking about things and seeing things, and that's why the narrative war is being lost by Israel, because it's being exposed in its various ways of oppressing people.
Okay, yeah, I mean, the flotilla is a great example, and obviously the dock workers refusing to load things. I mean, that's a a concrete physical material way of obstructing, the flow of.
Physical strikes,
Yeah.
like I'm all for like any kind of resistance, right? So I always say that, I support all forms of resistance to colonial violence. So if you are subject to colonial violence, then you have every right to resist that violence.
Mhm.
When people have gone into museums and thrown paint on on paintings and things, I'm fine with that.
Mhm.
Going to Elbit Systems factories and throwing paint, or, um, physically blocking some of these buildings. That's also a form of physical resistance. Obviously, violent resistance in the West is not something that has happened or necessarily should happen in that sense, but striking, not going to work, shutting down systems, right? Physically, I see that as being very powerful. But sadly, that requires a lot of organization, and
Yeah.
we'll get there. I think at some point we'll get there, but we're just not there right now.
Mhm. Are there any other things you think people should do on an individual level, or do you think it all comes down to organizing? It's probably a difficult question, but you have any thoughts?
I think at an individual level, we have a lot of power. We have a lot more power than we think we do, and I think small micro interactions are just as powerful as macro interactions or macro policies and things that we see at the macro level. Because, one of the things I always say is that, make Zionists uncomfortable wherever you go, because I don't think it should feel nice to say that I'm a Zionist and I support the genocide. Like, I don't think you should be comfortable, just like Nazis weren't made comfortable for the atrocities that they committed. So, especially with like IOF soldiers, there's a journalist, I think Dimitri Lascars, I think that's who came in Canada, who put together a list of IOF soldiers in Canada who served in the last 2 years, Canadians who
Mhm.
have served in the Israeli military. And he was, surprise, surprise, attacked for being anti Semitic, for making a due list. Um, but that is a form of resistance. That is a form of one individual, you know,
Yeah.
exposing and this idea of make IOF soldiers uncomfortable wherever they are, and you as an individual can do that. Um, and speaking up and owning your identity. I read something like very bizarre today about AI, well, Google's AI system and algorithm, where someone was trying to look up, this is a journalist, and they were looking through their Google Photos album, and they were trying to find some picture, because they were putting together this research article, and they had downloaded a bunch of pictures from early on in the genocide. And so they put Hamas in the search bar of their album, and the algorithm pulled up pictures of her children, her family, anyone wearing a keffiyeh, anyone in a protest with a Palestinian flag. So these algorithms they're designed, at least that particular example that this person gave and showed to the world, that look what happened when I put in Hamas, and you know anyone with a keffiyeh came up as being Hamas, right? And
Hmm.
exposing these systems at an individual level, like with
Yeah.
um, your experience with them. It's very powerful because our voices carry forward. We carry each other's voices forward. So at least that's the job that I'm doing. When I
Hmm.
started speaking up, it was 2014. My younger brother had just passed away, sadly, and I was grieving. And it was one of the attacks. It was during Ramadan, because of course it's during Ramadan when Israel attacks Palestine and Gaza, and it was one of their attacks, and hundreds of children had been killed, and I was really upset. I was doing my PhD at the time, but I was also grieving my brother's death, and I started to speak up online. And prior to that, I hadn't been very loud online. I was a PhD student. I was in this very vicarious kind of position. And I remember at the time, my reason for speaking out was because I had experienced grief at in such close range, with my brother. And all of a sudden, all these other things didn't matter, right? And I decided that I was going to speak up, even if it cost me my degree or my job. And I never looked back after that. And at the time, I didn't realize how powerful my social media advocacy would be. Even before October 7th, I had like 2,000 followers maybe on my various platforms, because some people cared and they were woke, but a lot of people just didn't understand what was happening. It was all very complicated. After October 7th, and because of the advocacy of people like me, so many people learned and were able to decolonize their minds and understand what was happening. And the fact, and I often say the fact that my follower count went from 2,000 to almost 50,000 on so many different platforms, is that it's actually an ode to how much people had a thirst for knowledge all of a sudden. And they really wanted to know what was happening. Because I hadn't changed. I'm not speaking any differently to before. But now all of a sudden, people were very interested in knowing. And that hasn't changed since then. I see more and more people constantly wanting to learn and be better. And, the time I said this in an event recently, that for all the times that we were accused of being woke by the far right, like people like Jordan Peterson were where there was a lot of anti-woke stuff going on and we were accused of being woke. I don't actually think we were woke. I
Right.
think we actually got woke after October 7th.
Hmm. Yeah. No, those are all really great points. And yeah, I mean, I guess on an individual level, yeah, it is just a lot about speaking our truth and pointing out anything that we observe that does seem unjust or seems, somehow, serving, these colonial structures, these oppressive structures. And it's interesting about, the kind of the, um, people who've served in the Israeli military. I think post October 7th, it is becoming increasingly stigmatized even in the West, and it will be interesting to see what happens. Um, over time. Anyway, I've kept you for a little while here, so thank you so much for um, giving us your time. So tell us before we go, tell us again about your upcoming book. Where people can find you, of course, online. Although most of them already know, but anything that you want us to know about before we
Yeah,
go.
absolutely. Thank you so much. Firstly, thank you so much for doing this and, having a
Absolutely.
platform like this for people like me. It's because of these platforms like the one you
Hmm.
have that, you know, voice and opportunity is given, you know, to people
Hmm.
like us and for others to be able to hear. So I thank you for that. Yeah, my book, which is co-written with my colleague, Dr. Ardavan, is called DEI Undone, and it really chronicles the rise, fall, and potential rebirth of the DEI industry. And the only way that that can happen is if we decolonize DEI. Um, you can follow my pages on Instagram, and I'm sure you're going to share some of the links
Hmm.
under the video anyway. And the book should be released in end of January, early February. But essentially, it's going to be an expose of the DEI industry, and a huge part of it is talking about the Palestine exception and how Palestine exposed the rot, in the industry. So yeah, I'll share more and just follow my page, and you'll be up to date with like the release dates and all of that. But thank you so much for having me. It's actually been an absolute pleasure, and you've asked some really good questions, and I think the conversation was fruitful.
Thank you so much. Yeah, the feeling is mutual. Okay, well, Dr. Sabreena Ghaffar-Siddiqui, thank you everyone for tuning in to Right of Resistance, and please join us next time for more talk about propaganda, injustice, and ways to resist. Thanks for watching. If you liked this episode, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and consider supporting the show on Patreon. Right of Resistance is an independent podcast. We don't have corporate sponsors or media backers. We rely on listeners like you. So if you want to help us grow, visit patreon.com/rightofresistance to become a member for as little as $3 a month. Every contribution makes a difference.